Hi YouTube. So today I want to talk to you about the Quartering Act of 1765. Now, this is something that I chose to write a paper on last semester. That paper was a historiography paper, which means that I wasn't looking so much at all the primary sources, although I did look at those to begin with just to get a good idea of what I was working on. But mainly it's looking at the writings of historians over the years, looking at how our perception, our interpretation has changed. And that was enlightening because I found that most historians who write on the American Revolution, they don't really have much to say about it. They mention it kind of offhand, but they never go into detail. So finding sources was a lot harder than I expected it to be. And I kind of went into it thinking, this is going to be a no-brainer. Britain was wrong. They were quartering their troops in private homes forcefully, whether the inhabitants wanted them there or not. That's what I thought, because everything that I'd always read implied that. So I was shocked once I actually got down to the research and I actually found some decent sources, because the history of the Quartering Act is not what most of us have been told to believe. That's what I want to get into today. I'm going to be going over a few notes that I have here because I am going to be quoting a couple of sources and I want to do that correctly. So first let's talk about British forces in America before the Revolution, before the Quartering Act was passed. Because if you haven't studied it, you may not know that the American colonies, or I should say the British colonies in America, they had been involved in quite a few disputes over the years. So at the end of the 17th century, we had the War of Spanish Succession. That's when we have William of Orange take over in England. He married James II's daughter, Mary, and they ruled as joint rulers. And something really significant about this is that William was a military man. He liked force for reasons. I mean, he needed to be able to protect his people, but with him, we see this increase in the size of the British army, this idea of a standing army. And that kind of plays in later, as we will see. And at that time, they had to come up with what they called the Mutiny Act. So with the standing army, they needed to be able to govern this army. They needed to have rules. And the Mutiny Act, it had regulations for behavior, for court-martialing, but it also said that in England, only England, British troops could not be forcibly quartered in private homes. That was a special right that English citizens had. They had this right to privacy, which was really, really new. This isn't something that was accepted and expected back then the way that it is now. So you have all this happening, and these protections are added in only for the English, not for the Irish, not for other colonies. But one of the other things that you see with that is that English subjects, if there was a regiment stationed near them, they were expected to provide provisions. So even though these troops were in their homes, there was still a list of provisions that they were expected to pay for to support His Majesty's army. And that's kind of how that worked. So the Mutiny Act would be renewed every year. If they had to make changes to it, adjustments, they'd do that, and then they'd renew it. They being Parliament here. So you have that. And then you have another series of wars. You have the Intercontinental Wars, where there is a American component. So in the 1760s, right before the Quartering Act, we had just come out of the French and Indian War, which was the American component of the 7 Years' War. So between all these intercontinental wars, the Indian Wars, all these different skirmishes and disputes, there had been a lot of fighting going on in the English colonies here in America. So I don't think anyone should really be that surprised that finally Parliament decided, you know what, we're going to start keeping troops there in case they're needed. And I think it was surprising to a few then, just because a standing army was still somewhat of a new concept. There hadn't been a standing army in the colonies before. So that's kind of new. But then when you look at the history of all of these fights, all these battles, all these wars, you kind of see that there is a little bit of logic there. And there's disputes among historians as far as why the standing army was going to be kept there. Was it to enforce laws, to coerce colonial obedience? Was it to protect from attack from their enemies? What was it? Maybe it was just Parliament wanted to keep this huge standing army. Or maybe I should blame King George III. Regardless, maybe they wanted to keep this huge standing army and they needed somewhere to put some of them. I don't know. Nobody knows. There really isn't good documentation proving one way or the other what the deciding factor was. So there's a lot of conjecture. And it could be a little bit of each, realistically. But what I want to talk about here is not so much that conjecture. I want to talk about what the bill actually was, what it actually did. So, we kind of set that stage. And then the other thing to understand is that during these wars, there was no set expectation of colonial support. So throughout all of these wars, Parliament and the Crown had funded the wars, had paid for everything. And periodically, colonies, their legislatures would vote to give money to the army during the war to help provide for it. They also voted money to build barracks so that there wouldn't be any question of quartering in private homes. They wanted to give another option to the army. So this is something that the colonies had done, but there was no legal requirement. There was no, okay, you have to provide X number of dollars, or you have to provide this, this, and this. There wasn't anything like that. So it was a very casual arrangement up until that point. And during war, they had motivation to vote for all these supplies. They had motivation to want to help out the army because the army was protecting them. But once the war is over, that motivation vanishes. They're not going to look at it the same way. They're not going to be incentivized to help support the army in the same way. And by the same token, Parliament was trying to figure out how to reduce cost. George Grenville, the Prime Minister of Parliament when the Quartering Act first passed, he was trying to kind of tighten the proverbial belt. He was trying to find ways to cut costs across the entire empire, not just on the colonies. So they had all this war debt. The standing army was expensive. They saw a reason to keep the regiments in the colonies, but someone had to pay for it. And out of that, we see a few different measures. So, we see the Stamp Act, which was going to indirectly support these costs and offset these war costs that they'd already paid for. But then we also see the Quartering Act. And in a way, that's going to directly offset the cost of a standing army. But Parliament's motivations are not what actually prompted the bill. That's not what started it. And I want to note, before I get into the history of actually where the bill came from, that not all colonists were opposed to the idea of there being a standing army. This wasn't something that there was this immediate and angry reaction to. There were some who were a little unsure, some who didn't really care. But interestingly, quite a few who later complained were more than happy to take advantage of their presence when it benefited them. So one of these quotes that I have for you, it's going to be a indirect quote, but in Robert Middlecoff's The Glorious Cause, which is primarily about the American Revolution, he doesn't get into the Quartering Act much as far as its creation, but he does tell an interesting story about the spring of 1766. Now, this is actually after the Quartering Act passed, but before Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of the British forces in America, before he had actually called upon the Quartering Act to try to get any supplies. So, spring of 1766, New York colony, there were a bunch of wealthy landowners who were facing a large-scale uprising from their tenants. And they had problems, they needed help. The funny thing is, these legislators are on the, well, I got that twisted. Right. So, not even going to edit that out, I'm just going to keep going. They were landowners, and they were in this legislature. So, the funny thing here is that they called on Gage for help to quell this uprising. But when it came time to go to the legislature and help out, kind of, you help me out, I'll help you out, they didn't want to help. And New York had probably the worst reaction to the Quartering Act, which I'm going to get back to now. So just kind of with all that background there, everything just starts to make a little bit more sense when you're looking at, what happened and why. So let me see here. The next thing I want to do before I talk about the bill itself is I want to talk about the key players, the people who made the Quartering Act happen. The first one I've already mentioned is Thomas Gage. He was a general. He was the commander-in-chief of the British forces in America after the French and Indian War. So he was the one in charge of, keeping the standing army housed and fed. And he knew it was going to be an issue because he'd been here during the French and Indian War. He'd seen how much of a struggle it could be to get supplies, even in time of war. So he knew that they were in for problems. And he asked his staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Robertson, to do an investigation, write a report, basically detailing what problems they were likely to have and what a potential solution would be. And between the two of them, they came up with this idea, which Gage wrote to Parliament about, to Whitehall. And he requested that the Mutiny Act, when it was renewed, that it be extended to include the American colonies. Now, this would have been huge because it would have put the American colonies on an equal footing with English citizens, which is a pretty big thing. Like I said, the Irish didn't have that. The Scottish really didn't have that. There was a standing rule that there was no private quartering in Scotland, but realistically it happened. So the colonies would have been on a higher footing than these other areas under British control. So the only thing that Gage wanted different from the same thing that all the English had was that Gage did request they be allowed to quarter in private homes. But this wasn't his preference. He was just aware that on the frontier, in some rural areas, there simply weren't buildings to house soldiers unless it was a private home. There were no barracks, there were no inns, there was nothing like that they could use. So he wanted to have that sort of in his back pocket just in case. But overall, he was perfectly happy with the barrack system that the colonies had set up. That really wasn't an issue. So he writes to Whitehall and he makes this request. The problem is that by the time George Grenville, the Prime Minister, had received this and actually paid attention to the letter, they'd already passed the renewal of the Mutiny Act that year. That was already done. So what they decided to do, because the letter made sense to them, is that they passed a separate bill, which we know as the Quartering Act of 1765. So they saw it as kind of an extension of the Mutiny Act, and in fact, they copied a lot of the language out of the Mutiny Act. So it still pretty much was exactly what Gage had asked for, it's just in appearances. It didn't appear that it was putting them on the same footing as English. It appeared as if it was a separate thing targeting only colonists. And appearances were a big part of the problem when it came to this bill. But they put it together, and they sent a draft to King George III for him to give his approval. And this is something else that surprised me, because, King George III, we're told about, all the ways that the king had abused his American subjects, how he took them for granted and he didn't take care of them. But in this case, he did. In this case, he sent the draft back to Grenville, and he said no. He said, I will not agree to the clause allowing private billeting or private quartering in homes. That's not acceptable. He wasn't thinking about the logic that Gage had on the frontier. He was thinking about how it would appear to specify that the Americans were different from the English in that way, and he wasn't okay with it. So, point to King George III on that. But at this point, Grenville has to change the draft. He has to figure out a way to make everyone happy with this. And he enlists the help of several Americans who were in England at that time, the most notable being Benjamin Franklin. He was living in London as an emissary of Pennsylvania, there on behalf of the colonists' cause. And he was brought in on this, and he was excited. He helped change the wording. He helped change it. He gave them an idea of, what measures the colonists would probably be okay with, what they wouldn't be okay with. And when they got to the final bill, Franklin was excited because he thought this was, this was an example of imperial unity. He thought this was good for the colonists because, again, it put him on the same foot as English. His political career barely survived that, because when word of what we call the Quartering Act, it's also called the American Mutiny Act, has a few different variations there, but when word of the Quartering Act got to the colonies, the way it was reported by the newspapers was not, oh, hey, imperial unity. No, it was, they were reporting on that clause that didn't even make it into the bill, but their entire focus was, hey, they almost said that soldiers could be forced into our homes. And I mean, remember, there was no prohibition on this before. There was no legal protection that they had. And throughout the various wars, there had been quartering in homes. But having it in writing, having it in the law, is a scary thing. And that's what they focused on. They didn't focus on what the bill gave them. They focused on what it expected of them. Because in addition to that clause that was removed, the Quartering Act expected them to find housing, whether it was the barracks or public buildings that weren't in use or whatever else it was. And the colonies were now expected to provide the same list of provisions that English citizens were expected to provide when there are regiments in their areas. And this is like firewood, food, cooking utensils, and small beer or rum, which is basically watered down liquor. So it's not a strong liquor that's going to make them drunk. It's just a safe choice to drink because the drinking water everywhere is not safe. So that's what it was. That's what it did. But because of the uproar from the newspapers, it took Gage a while before he even tried to use this bill to provide for his men. And that's what I was getting back to when I talked about the spring of 1766 with those landowners in New York. The bill had passed in 65. Gage didn't use it right away. He was waiting for people to calm down, people to, decide, okay, this might be all right, for him to see how he needed to proceed. So he ended up sending a bunch of regiments to the middle colonies. So this was New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. And when we look at the reaction to the Quartering Act, those are really where we pay the most attention. Because it's easy for South Carolina or Virginia to be like, yeah, okay, we'll go with this. When they don't have a bunch of troops there, they're not really having to shell out the money. And money was a problem here. Because around the same time, Parliament had also passed the Currency Act, which required them to use pound sterling to pay for all these things when the colonies were used to paying with different types of bills from different sources. So that kind of made it harder to comply. But Pennsylvania complied completely. They're like, hey, okay, sure, we can go with this. They already had barracks. That was not a problem. New Jersey pretty much complied. Most of the colonies were like, okay, hey, what do we need to do to make this work? New York refused. Outright refused. Like, there was no, oh, we'll give you that. No, they weren't happy. And I do think that's ironic given that New York was where those landowners needed help, and then nothing. But optics are important. And optics are a big part of why the Quartering Act had issues. So we have the Quartering Act of 65. But then the Quartering Act, like the Mutiny Act, was going to be renewed every year so that they could make changes. And those changes came in 1769. They made the first set. Gage had kind of reported to Whitehall his experiences with trying to use it and, where there were still issues. So in 69, there were a couple of things that happened there, right? So again, they looked to possibly add that clause to allow quartering in private homes. That got put on the books again to look at. But again, King George III stood up for the colonists, and he said no. He said, we're not going to do that. So again, it was struck from the bill. It was never put in the bill. So one of the other quotes I have here for you is from John Gilbert McCurdy's book Quarters. And this is one of the best sources I found. Kudos to him, because he did look at a topic that most have ignored. But what he had to say about the changes in 1769 is, quote, realistically, British lawmakers simply codified General Gage's practice of allowing the Americans considerable latitude over how they accommodated, supplied, and transported British soldiers. Parliament quickly approved the revised statute in March 1769, no doubt hoping the changes would de-escalate tensions and encourage colonial compliance. End quote. So, again, they're not trying to make things worse. These men in England genuinely think they're doing the colonists a favor. Maybe not the kind of favor the colonists wanted, but they're trying to make it work here. But again, it didn't go over well. Honestly, I don't think the changes in 69 really had much of a reaction. There was more going on at the time. And then there was one more change to the Quartering Act, and that is the Quartering Act of 1774. Now, when you hear people talk about the Quartering Act, this is the one that they're usually referring to. They kind of ignore everything before, and they're just focusing on this. And the thing with 1774 was we'd already had, the Boston Tea Party. Troops had already been sent to Boston trying to get the rabble under control. And British soldiers, well, not the soldiers, the leadership of the British Army, they felt the need to be within the city itself to do the duties they had been given. So, whether they liked it or not, whether they wanted to be there, whether they agreed, didn't matter. They had a duty to do. They were supposed to be in the town keeping order. And the barracks that Massachusetts had built were on Castle Island. So this is in the Boston Harbor. This is a little ways away from the town itself. And up until this point, any troops in this area had always been barracked on Castle Island. But at this time, Gage and leadership felt that they could not keep all the troops there and still keep order in Boston like they were meant to do. So the change of 1774 was for Parliament to specify that British forces were not required to use the barracks they were provided first. That they were allowed, if they felt it necessary, to use other buildings for quartering their troops so that the troops could be where they needed to be. And this is where people try to act like there was forced quartering in homes. That's not what this was. That it never, ever was. I cannot stress this enough. Because all it was is it was giving the British Army the right to find unused buildings, public buildings, inns, areas like that where they could house troops to keep them where they were needed. That's all it was. They were never trying to go in the homes. If they were in homes, it's because the homeowner invited soldiers to stay there or were happy to get the money they could get by quartering troops. They were never, ever, during this period, forced into private homes. That only happened earlier in the century, during times of war, before the Quartering Act was even a thing. And I know I keep harping on this, but this is the thing. This is the thing that we're all told, that this is private quartering in homes, and it's not. So again, I cannot stress it enough. So by this point, the revolution is basically broken out. The last time General Gage actually used the act to procure supplies or housing was in 1775, and Parliament did not bother to renew it after 1776, so the Quartering Act ceased to exist because they're in the middle of war. And something else to note, during war, all of this went out the window. The armies did whatever they needed for supplies and for housing, and when I say that, I don't just mean the British Army, I mean the Continental Army too. Because a lot of the things that colonists complained about the British Standing Army doing in times of peace, the Continental Army did during war without hesitation because they needed to. And somehow us Americans have managed to get over that fact in our history. We ignore that fact, but we're going to harp on some quartering that never even happened. So, now I want to talk about how we got here. So at the beginning I said that my paper was a historiography paper. I was talking about the progression of what historians have said on the topic. So it is a good question to ask, oh, wait a minute, if this isn't true, then why do we think it? Why is this implied? Why is it popular myth? And a couple of sources that I want to draw your attention to are the earliest histories written about our revolution. They were written by Americans in the years after the war, and in some ways, they're nationalist propaganda. And I don't mean to criticize these writers when I say that, but these are people who lived through the war. They're excited about victory, and they're so excited about their new nation that it's kind of a natural thing to want to kind of boost up your nation, boost up their cause. You're justifying their cause. You're justifying everything that just happened when you write your history. So my delightful phone did not save the end of the initial video I did, so I'm going to redo this last part. Just talking about some of the earliest writings of historians on these events that kind of set the tone for how we would perceive the Quartering Act in the modern day. And some of the earliest writings were nationalist propaganda. And I don't mean that as an insult. These were people who lived through the war. They're people who were excited about their new nation. So it's kind of natural that they were going to highlight their victory and kind of downplay anything that showed that maybe they didn't have as much reason as they've said for the revolution. First example being David Ramsay, published in 1789, his The History of the American Revolution. He doesn't really cover the Quartering Act. That's something that this has been going on that long. Very little bit that he said was that there were concerns regarding British troops in America, that Parliament might continue taxation, quote, for the support of such military force as they should think proper, end quote. That's really all he said. He did make a brief mention to quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, kind of like what our founding fathers say in the founding documents on our list of complaints about King George III, but that's really all he says. So it's a what if. It's not, he's not saying here's an example of how they abused their being here and they were abusing the populace with their presence. No, it is just a concern about what could have happened had it continued. And then the other early example is Mercy Otis Warren. So she was married to James Warren. She was the sister of James Otis, who gave the famous speech I think I referenced earlier on the writs of assistance. Maybe I didn't. Yeah, it was a big deal at the time. And she was also a friend of other founders like Samuel Adams. So she published it was 1805 when she finally published, but it's still early on. It was her The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. And again, she doesn't really list complaints on, how the Quartering Act abused the populace. That's not what it was. She focuses on the draft of that initial bill where they considered the clause to allow quartering in private homes. I've already covered that never happened, but that is what she focuses on, that it was even considered is the objection. She asserts that such provision was intended to, quote, more easily awe the people into submission, end quote. And I agree. If it had passed and they had actually used that in cities and areas where there were other accommodations available and they chose to do that instead, then yes, that would have been a means of trying to get submission. That clearly would have been what it was. The problem is that there's no evidence through their actual actions to prove that that's what they were trying to do. So those are two early writers. Both of them lived through the Revolution, and that kind of sets the tone, which all the historians afterwards more or less picked up. If you're looking to read a bit more on this topic, maybe you don't believe me, and I'm not sure I can blame you because this goes against everything I had always thought too. But if you want to read more, check out John Shy's Toward Lexington, which is pretty good. Meryl Jensen's The Founding of a Nation. And on this particular topic, if this specifically is what you want to read on, check out John Gilbert McCurdy's Quarters, The Accommodation of the British Army and the Coming of the American Revolution. His was probably the most helpful of the sources I found for writing that historiography, just because he's the only one that actually managed to go into it in detail. If you're looking for more of a general read, not on this topic, but just on the period, Robert Middlecoff's The Glorious Cause is also pretty good. That's the one that I got the story from earlier on the landowners in New York. But he doesn't really cover the Quartering Act otherwise, so that would just be more of a general book on the American Revolution. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, didn't like it, there's something you want me to expand on in another video, please leave a comment below and let me know. Thank you.